Africa, the cradle of humanity, had already seen centuries of civilizations, empires, and colonial exploitation. But in the 20th century, the world's greatest conflicts reached African soil: World War I, 1914 to 1918, and World War II, 1939 to 1945. These wars were fought far from Europe's capitals, yet their effects were profound. Millions of Africans were recruited as soldiers, porters, and laborers. Colonial powers exploited African resources and manpower, reshaping the continent politically, socially, and economically. This documentary tells the untold African story of the world wars, exploring heroism, tragedy, and the seeds of Africa's fight for independence. When World War I broke out, Africa was almost entirely under European colonial rule. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy controlled the continent. Colonial powers quickly recruited Africans to serve. British West Africa Regiment in Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone. King's African Rifles in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. French colonial troops from Senegal, Algeria, and Morocco. African soldiers were sent to fight in Europe, the Middle East, and within Africa itself. One of the largest campaigns was in German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, where General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck waged a guerrilla war, resisting Allied forces for 4 years. Africa was also a resource battlefield. Colonies were forced to supply food, rubber, minerals, and manpower to support the war effort. Infrastructure, such as railways, was developed for military purposes but often exploited local labor under harsh conditions. Impact on Africa. Millions of Africans were conscripted or forced into labor. Entire regions faced famine due to wartime requisitioning of food. Exposure to new political ideas, military training, and international networks planted the seeds for anti-colonial movements. Post-war treaties, such as the Treaty of Versailles, stripped Germany of its African colonies, handing them to Britain, France, and Belgium, creating new colonial borders that would last decades. Africans fought bravely across the globe. In France and Belgium, West African troops, the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, faced brutal trench warfare. In the Middle East, East African regiments supported British campaigns in Egypt and Palestine. Despite bravery, African soldiers faced racial discrimination. Lower pay compared to European soldiers. Inferior equipment and living conditions. Denial of recognition for acts of valor. Yet these experiences transformed Africa. Exposure to modern warfare and global politics empowered soldiers to demand rights and equality post-war. Returnees brought new ideas of self-determination, which later fueled nationalist movements. After World War I, Africa's political landscape changed. Germany's colonies were divided under the League of Nations mandates. African veterans returned home, often ignored and marginalized, fueling resentment. Economic hardships worsened due to post-war taxation, inflation, and forced labor policies. But Africa also experienced cultural revival. Schools and urban centers spread ideas of nationalism. Pan-Africanism emerged, with leaders like Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois inspiring African intellectuals. The stage was set for a larger, more global conflict just 2 decades later. World War II had a greater African impact than World War I, directly affecting North Africa and involving millions more African troops. North African Campaign, battles in Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia, involving the British 8th Army and German Afrika Korps under Rommel. East African Campaign, British and Ethiopian forces expelled Italian troops from Ethiopia and Somalia. West African contributions, soldiers fought in Burma, India, and Southeast Asia. African colonies again supplied men, food, and resources, with conscription reaching unprecedented levels. Over 2.5 million Africans fought, while millions more served as laborers and porters. Impact on Africa. Wartime exposure accelerated African political consciousness. Nationalist movements grew stronger. Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria saw the rise of independence leaders. Colonized Africans began questioning European supremacy after witnessing its weaknesses during the war. Haile Selassie of Ethiopia led resistance against Italian invasion in 1935-36 and became a symbol of African sovereignty. Queen of Burundi and local leaders organized guerrilla resistance against European occupation. African soldiers' bravery in Italy, Burma, and North Africa proved that Africans were capable of global military excellence. African economies were diverted toward war production. Traditional agriculture and trade suffered, causing famine and unrest. Millions of Africans migrated internally or abroad for work. Families were displaced, and communities destabilized. Returning veterans became political activists. New African political parties formed, demanding self-governance. Exposure to global ideas of freedom, equality, and democracy reshaped African culture. Pan-African conferences inspired the post-war independence movements. By 1945, the world had changed. Europe was weakened. Colonial powers could no longer fully control Africa. African leaders and movements demanded freedom and sovereignty. Countries began gaining independence. Libya, 1951. Ghana, 1957. Algeria, 1962. Kenya, 1963. Nigeria, 1960. World War I and II were turning points, awakening African consciousness and setting the stage for the liberation of the continent. The story of Africa in the world wars is one of courage, sacrifice, and resilience. Millions of Africans fought, endured, and resisted, shaping not only the fate of the continent but the world. Today, Africa continues to rise, inspired by the legacy of those who endured global conflict and fought for freedom. The world may have seen Africa as a colony, but Africans saw themselves as warriors, thinkers, and builders of the future. Africa's journey through the world wars reminds us, history is written not only in the victor's lands but in every land that stood resilient. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share this video to keep African history alive.